Welcome, dear listener, to a place where mysteries come alive. Here, we bring you timeless tales of clever detectives, hidden motives, and unexpected twists. Whether it's the daring charm of Tommy and Tuppence, or the keen intellect of Poirot, every story invites you to think, to feel, and to solve the case. Stay curious, and welcome to Guardian of the Night Stories. The rain fell steadily upon the Kentish countryside as the afternoon train pulled into Marchmont Station, a modest platform serving the small village of Marchmont and its surrounding estates. Hercule Poirot, seated in a first-class compartment with meticulous precision, observed the weather with the same careful attention he applied to all phenomena, noting its consistency, its pattern, its inevitable conclusion. Rain, he reflected, was democracy in its purest form. It fell upon the just and the unjust alike. He descended onto the platform with deliberate care, his gleaming shoes finding purchase on the wet stone. His perfectly waxed moustache, maintained at an immaculate angle despite the damp air, was the first thing noticed by Inspector Jameson, who stood beneath a black umbrella waiting to greet him. Monsieur Poirot? Jameson extended a weathered hand. He was a man of perhaps 60, with the competent bearing of one who had served Scotland Yard in minor capacities for too many years. "But yes," Poirot replied, acknowledging the greeting with a slight inclination of his head. "Inspector Jameson, I presume? You have made the journey in this disagreeable weather." The drive to Marchmont took 20 minutes, winding through lanes bordered by ancient oaks and hedgerows heavy with autumn dampness. The village itself was a study in English propriety. A high street of red brick buildings, a parish church with a Norman tower, an inn called the White Hart that advertised itself with a swinging sign. It was precisely the sort of place where, Poirot reflected, nothing of consequence ever happened. Precisely the sort of place where murder, therefore, became all the more remarkable. The victim, Poirot began, watching the landscape resolve itself into a more affluent quarter as they proceeded. Miss Catherine Ashford, 32 years old, unmarried, lived at Marchmont Hall, the principal residence of the area. Her father, the late Sir Edmund Ashford, died 6 years ago, leaving Miss Ashford as mistress of the house. And her demise? Poison, Monsieur Poirot, strychnine, found in her bedroom on the morning of October 11th. The servants discovered her in considerable distress during the night. There were calls for help, but by the time assistance arrived, she was beyond recovery. They turned into a long drive, flanked by magnificent beeches. Through their thinning foliage emerged Marchmont Hall, a Victorian Gothic pile of red sandstone and mullioned windows, all turrets and gables and the architectural exuberance of the 1880s. Who discovered the body? Poirot inquired. Miss Ashford's lady's maid, a woman named Eleanor Finch. She had gone to Miss Ashford's room at dawn when the bell was not rung for morning tea. The room was locked. Miss Ashford habitually locked her door from the inside, and Miss Finch had to fetch the housekeeper for the keys. Poirot's eyes narrowed. A locked room, you say? Indeed. The windows were closed and latched. No possibility of external entry. They descended from the motor car, and Poirot allowed himself a measured survey of the facade. There was something about this house, something in the arrangement of its windows, the blank expression of its stonework, that suggested secrets carefully maintained. "Tell me," Poirot said, turning to Jameson, "what brought you to Marchmont? Surely such a matter would ordinarily be investigated by the local constabulary." Jameson shifted slightly, the movement betraying embarrassment. It was Miss Ashford's solicitor, Mr. Calloway. He knew someone at the Yard. There were certain complications regarding the estate. You see, and he wished for discretion. The matter has attracted some attention in the local press, and given Miss Ashford's position in society. Poirot nodded. The unspoken implication was clear enough. An investigation conducted with sufficient subtlety might preserve the reputation of the deceased and her family from the more sensational interpretations of murder. He rather approved of this English discretion, even as it amused him. And when precisely did this discovery occur? The night of October 10th to the 11th. Though we've determined from the physical evidence that death likely occurred in the early hours, between 2 and 4 in the morning. But the body exhibited signs of poisoning before this discovery. Miss Finch reports that she heard Miss Ashford's bell ringing at approximately 2 o'clock. When she investigated, she heard Miss Ashford crying out in distress. Miss Finch endeavoured to gain entry but found the door locked. She called for assistance, and by the time the door was opened, Miss Ashford was in severe convulsions. She died within minutes. They had reached the entrance to the hall. Poirot paused at the great oak doors, which were painted a deep Victorian green. "Inspector Jameson," he said thoughtfully, "I observe that you have been at this investigation for 3 days. Tell me, do you believe this to be a case of suicide?" The inspector's face darkened. "No, Monsieur Poirot, I do not. And neither do you, I suspect, or you would not have come." A slight smile played about Poirot's mouth. Perhaps this Inspector Jameson was not entirely without merit. "Come then," he said. "Let us examine the scene where Miss Catherine Ashford departed this world." Marchmont Hall's interior reflected the tastes and pretensions of the late Sir Edmund Ashford. Heavy mahogany furnishings, Persian carpets of genuine antiquity, paintings of ancestors whose expressions suggested disapproval of posterity. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hartwell, a woman of perhaps 55 with the severe bearing of one who has maintained domestic order for decades, received them with appropriate deference. Miss Ashford's room remains precisely as it was discovered, she informed them, leading the way up a grand staircase adorned with portraits. "I have allowed no one within save for the police inspector and the doctor." The room itself was a study in feminine refinement. Cream and pale green wallpaper, a substantial 4-poster bed with damask hangings, windows that overlooked the gardens toward the distant church spire. The smell of strychnine lingered in the air, that characteristic acrid, musty odour that Poirot knew well. He conducted his examination with methodical precision, noting the position of the furniture, the arrangement of objects on the dressing table, the particular placement of a half-empty glass of water on the bedside table. "The poison was administered in this glass?" he inquired. "It appears so," Jameson confirmed. "Dr. Hastings found traces in the residue at the bottom. The strychnine was dissolved in water, a considerable quantity, enough to ensure rapid action." Poirot lifted the glass with a handkerchief, examining it with his magnifying lens. The room was cool, very cool, and he noted this fact carefully. The window? Locked from the inside, as I mentioned. The key remains in the lock. Poirot moved to the window and examined it with the same meticulous care. Well maintained, certainly. No signs of tampering. The latch was of a simple but effective design, the mechanism smooth and reliable. He turned his attention to the dressing table. Upon it lay the typical appointments of a lady's toilet. Combs and brushes of silver, a jewellery box, a hand mirror. There were also several books, a novel by Mrs. Humphrey Ward, a volume of poetry, a bound journal. "This journal," Poirot said, indicating it. "Did Miss Ashford maintain a diary?" "It appears so," Jameson said. "We have not examined it thoroughly, given its personal nature. The solicitor, Mr. Calloway, suggested that such documents might be best regarded by someone of greater discretion than a police inspector. Poirot felt a flicker of amusement at this transparent appeal to his vanity. He opened the journal and scanned several pages. The handwriting was firm and decisive, belonging to a woman of intelligence and considerable force of character. The entries were dated and detailed, recording not merely events, but observations and opinions. One entry, dated September 31st, just 10 days before her death, caught his attention. I have made my decision. Whatever the consequences, whatever objections are raised, I shall do what conscience dictates. Let them judge me if they will. I did not make them arbiters of my fate. V grows increasingly difficult. I am not certain how much longer I can tolerate the situation, but I must be patient. All will be resolved shortly, one way or another. Curious, Poirot murmured. Miss Ashford appears to have been burdened by something of significance. Who, I wonder, is this V? We have not determined that, Jameson admitted. Poirot moved to the wardrobe and examined its contents. The clothing within was of excellent quality and conservative taste. Nothing ostentatious, everything suggesting a woman of means but sober judgment. He noticed, however, that one garment appeared disturbed, as though hastily replaced. This dress here, he indicated it. It has been recently worn, but not recently laundered. Note the slight disorder of its folds. The faint impression where it was quickly returned to the wardrobe. Miss Ashford had worn this dress immediately prior to her death, would you not say? Jameson leaned closer. By heaven, you're right. It's a dinner dress, rather formal for wearing alone in one's room. Indeed, and yet she wore it. Why? A dinner party, perhaps? A visitor of some importance? He turned his attention to the desk positioned near the window. Here lay the instruments of correspondence, writing paper of good quality, fountain pens, bottles of ink. Poirot examined the items carefully, noting that the most recently used pen bore ink stains, consistent with the ink bottles present. But something else drew his attention. A small burn mark on the writing surface, as though a hot object had been placed there, and beneath the blotter he discovered a scrap of paper, burned at the edges, containing only a few words in Miss Ashford's hand. The agreement is null and void. He cannot force me. I shall... The sentence ended abruptly, the paper torn or destroyed before completion. You have found something? Jameson asked eagerly. Perhaps, or perhaps nothing. In my experience, Inspector, the significance of clues often lies not in their obvious meaning, but in their relationship to one another. This scrap of paper tells us that Miss Ashford was in dispute with someone. The burned edges suggest she attempted to destroy it. But why destroy it only partially? Why leave traces of its existence? There is something deliberate in this incompleteness, n'est-ce pas? Jameson appeared puzzled, but Poirot did not press the matter. Instead, he turned to practical inquiry. I wish now to meet those who resided in this house, and those who had significant connection to Miss Ashford. Inspector, perhaps you might arrange for me to speak with the household staff first, and then the family members, I presume. There is no immediate family remaining, Jameson explained, but there are several individuals who have intimate connection to the household. Miss Ashford's cousin, Mr. Victor Ashford, resides here. There is also her uncle, Mr. Henry Ashford, who lives in the village proper. Then there is the question of Lord Marchmont himself. He resides at his country estate some 3 miles distant, though he has considerable involvement in local affairs. And finally, there is Mr. Richard Calloway, the solicitor I mentioned who visits regularly regarding estate matters. A neat arrangement, Poirot observed. 4 individuals with clear connection to Miss Ashford, and each, I presume, possesses knowledge of the house's layout, its routines, its vulnerabilities. You suspect one of them, then? Poirot permitted himself the faintest smile. Inspector, at this preliminary stage, I suspect everyone. It is the only intellectually honest position. Over the course of the following day, Poirot established himself in a room at the White Hart and conducted a series of interviews with those connected to Miss Ashford's life. The process was conducted with exquisite courtesy, yet Poirot's questions possessed a penetrating quality that left his interviewees with the distinct impression that he saw far more than they revealed. Victor Ashford was the first to be interviewed, a man of 35 with the bearing of one accustomed to comfortable circumstances. Victor had the slightly dissipated appearance of a gentleman who had never been entirely occupied with purposeful endeavour. His hands were soft, his eyes somewhat watery, and he possessed the curious habit of glancing toward the door, as though calculating distances. "A dreadful business," Victor began, before Poirot had scarcely introduced the purpose of his inquiry. Catherine was a remarkable woman, though perhaps not always easy to live with. Strong-willed, you understand, particular about matters of principle. And you, Mr. Ashford, you resided in the same house. Yes, for the past 4 years. My own circumstances being somewhat reduced, Catherine was kind enough to offer me accommodation. We are cousins, after all, and family ought to assist family. Most commendable. And Miss Ashford? Was she in good spirits during recent weeks? Victor hesitated, and in that hesitation Poirot perceived the presence of significant information. She was preoccupied, Victor admitted at last. There had been some matter of business concerning the estate, a dispute, I believe, though Catherine did not discuss the particulars with me. She was quite private regarding such matters. And the night of her death? Where were you? I was in the library reading. I retired to bed at approximately 11 o'clock, I believe. I heard nothing unusual until the commotion the following morning, when Eleanor Finch began calling for assistance. Poirot noted the vagueness of this account, the strategic placement of "I believe" and similar qualifications. Here was a man either genuinely uncertain or deliberately obscuring his movements. One final question, Mr. Ashford. Miss Ashford kept a journal. In it, she made reference to someone identified only as V. Would you happen to know whom she might have meant? Victor's face flushed slightly. No, I cannot imagine. Perhaps it was merely a notation of some sort. But Poirot observed the contraction of the muscles around his eyes, the slight compression of his lips. Here was someone who knew precisely whom the initial referred to, and who found the knowledge profoundly uncomfortable. Henry Ashford proved a different character entirely. At 67, he was Victor's uncle and a retired solicitor of some reputation. Where Victor was diffuse and evasive, Henry was direct and commanding, with the clarity of mind that comes from a lifetime of professional precision. My niece was a woman of considerable moral conviction, Henry said, settled in a comfortable chair at the White Hart's lounge, perhaps excessively so in some respects. She had views regarding the proper conduct of business and personal affairs that were quite inflexible. An admirable quality, perhaps. Admirable in principle, yes, but inflexibility often leads to conflict, Monsieur Poirot. Catherine had recently discovered certain matters concerning the administration of the Marchmont estate that she considered improper. She intended to investigate the matter thoroughly, and I suspect she was prepared to make her findings public, whatever the consequences. And who might be implicated in these improper matters? That I cannot say with certainty, but I know that Catherine had been in communication with a firm of auditors in London, and I know that she had requested certain documents from the estate's manager. This was valuable information. The woman whom Poirot had read about in the journal entries was beginning to resolve into a portrait of someone who had stumbled upon wrongdoing and possessed both the courage and the principle to address it. Lord Marchmont was his next interview, conducted at Marchmont Manor, a house of considerably greater grandeur than Marchmont Hall. Lord Marchmont himself was a man of perhaps 70, with silver hair and the bearing of one accustomed to authority. He received Poirot in a library lined with leather-bound volumes, many of which appeared never to have been opened. Miss Ashford was a considerable woman, Lord Marchmont began without preamble, intelligent, principled, and unfortunately not entirely amenable to accepting the practical necessities that govern affairs of business and estate management. She had been making inquiries regarding the administration of certain properties, largely unnecessary inquiries, in my view, based on incomplete information. And she was dissatisfied with your response to these inquiries. She was dissatisfied with the responses offered by my managers and solicitors. As for my own response, I had not yet provided one. We had arranged a meeting for the morning after her death. Poirot noted this detail with considerable interest. A meeting you were both anticipating? It seemed necessary. Miss Ashford had suggested that certain matters required urgent clarification. Yet she was dead before this meeting could occur. A most convenient circumstance, would you not say? A flash of irritation crossed Lord Marchmont's features. I did not murder the woman, Monsieur Poirot, if that is your implication. Whatever her suspicions regarding my estate management, they did not constitute sufficient cause for me to resort to murder. My reputation might have suffered, but I would have weathered it. I have weathered considerably worse. The statement was made with such conviction and such utter absence of apparent anxiety that Poirot was inclined to believe it. A guilty man, in his experience, generally possessed at least a residuum of nervous tension. Lord Marchmont appeared genuinely unconcerned. Finally, Poirot interviewed Richard Calloway, the solicitor who had originally engaged him. Calloway was a thin man of perhaps 50, with the careful demeanour of one whose profession required strict neutrality in matters of family conflict. Miss Ashford sought my advice regarding certain documents. Calloway explained carefully. I advised her that if she believed improprieties had occurred, the proper course would be to engage an independent auditor to examine the records, which she did, and the result of this examination. The auditor's report arrived on October 9th. Miss Ashford received it that morning. I do not know the specific contents, but I gathered that it confirmed her suspicions regarding certain irregularities in the accounting. Irregularities substantial enough to constitute fraud. Calloway hesitated. Potentially, yes. The auditor suggested that certain disbursements might be questioned, and that Lord Marchmont's manager, a Mr. William Thornton, had made entries that did not correspond to actual expenditures. Here, Poirot reflected, was motivation, not the crude motivation of simple greed, but the more refined motivation that comes from having one's dishonesty exposed, one's reputation threatened, one's entire position rendered precarious, and yet... That evening, seated in his room at the White Hart, Poirot reviewed his notes with meticulous care. He had the sensation, that subtle intuition developed through years of investigation, that he was observing a pattern not yet fully resolved. A woman who had discovered fraud, a woman who had locked herself in her room, a woman who had drunk poisoned water in the early hours of the morning. The question that preoccupied Poirot was not merely who had poisoned Miss Ashford, but how. The locked room remained the central puzzle. He had examined it himself with the utmost care, and found no mechanism by which poison could have been introduced from without. And then there was the matter of the dress. Over the next several days, a peculiar tension settled over the village of Marchmont. Rumours proliferated with the enthusiasm that small communities bring to matters of scandal. Some suggested that Victor Ashford had poisoned his cousin in order to inherit her wealth. Others whispered that Lord Marchmont's manager had acted to prevent exposure of his thefts. Still others proposed more exotic theories involving secret lovers and illicit affairs. Poirot observed all of this with his characteristic detachment. He attended the local shops, the parish church, the White Hart's bar, listening to the conversations of farmers, shopkeepers, and retired gentlemen. From this seemingly random intelligence, a picture began to emerge. A picture that suggested Miss Ashford had not been universally beloved, despite her evident qualities. Miss Ashford was rather proud, Mrs. Hartwell admitted when Poirot questioned her further. She could be kind, certainly, but she had a manner of suggesting that others were beneath her in moral standing. Some of the village people took offence at that. And the household staff, were they content in their positions? Mostly, yes, though Eleanor Finch, Miss Ashford's lady's maid, has been particularly affected by the murder. She and Miss Ashford were quite close, you understand. Not merely mistress and servant, but something approaching friends. Eleanor has blamed herself for not being able to prevent the tragedy, though there was nothing she could have done, poor girl. Poirot had noticed this in his own interview with Eleanor. She was a girl of perhaps 23, with a sensitive nature and considerable affection for her late mistress. Her account of finding the body had been consistent with Jameson's report, and she had offered no information that seemed particularly significant. Yet something troubled Poirot about Eleanor. There was an evasiveness in her manner when questioned about her duties on the night of Miss Ashford's death. When pressed about whether she had heard any conversation or movement outside Miss Ashford's room, she had claimed to have heard nothing, despite the clear evidence that Miss Ashford had rung the bell at 2 in the morning. It was on the 5th day of his investigation that Poirot made a discovery that altered the entire complexion of the case. He had returned to Marchmont Hall and requested permission to examine Miss Ashford's room once more. Mrs. Hartwell had granted this with apparent indifference, and Poirot had spent a careful hour reviewing every detail, every object, every spatial relationship within the chamber. It was the window that held his attention. He examined it from multiple angles, testing the mechanism repeatedly, noting the dust patterns on the sill, the condition of the frame, and then he observed something that had escaped both his previous examination and that of the police. The window frame itself was sound and showed no signs of tampering, but the caulking that held the panes of glass in place was new, very new. The caulking along the outer portion of the frame was considerably younger than that on the interior, and there were faint traces of another caulking material. Embedded in the wooden frame, traces of an older preparation that had been removed. Poirot called for a ladder and examined the exterior of the window with meticulous care. Here was the explanation. The window had been unsealed from the outside, the glass removed, carefully, precisely, and then replaced and resealed with new caulking that matched the interior appearance sufficiently to escape casual observation. It was brilliant, dangerous certainly, the work of someone with knowledge of glazing, but brilliant nonetheless. Now the locked room mystery resolved itself. The poisoned water could have been introduced at any point during the evening, placed carefully upon the bedside table before the window was sealed once more. Miss Ashford, retiring for the evening in her formal dinner dress, would have had no reason to suspect the beverage was anything other than the water she had requested hours earlier. But if the window had been sealed from outside, that implied something of extraordinary significance. Access to the exterior of the house. Access that would have required either familiarity with the grounds or considerable effort to acquire. Poirot descended the ladder and walked to the rear of the house, where he examined the geometry of the architecture. Miss Ashford's window was on the first floor, but it was set at an angle to the corner of the building, placed such that a person might reach it from a particular portion of the roof if they possessed both courage and climbing ability, or, and this seemed far more probable, it could be accessed from the drain pipe that descended from the roof and ran directly past the window. He tested the drain pipe with some of his weight. It was solid Victorian iron, rusted but structurally sound. A person of reasonable agility could certainly climb it. That evening, Poirot requested an urgent meeting with Inspector Jameson. The window was unsealed from outside, he explained, showing Jameson his evidence. The glass was removed, replaced, and resealed with new caulking. The poisoned water was introduced earlier in the evening before this operation was performed. But who could have performed such work? Jameson asked. It would require considerable skill and specific knowledge. Indeed, it would, which suggests someone with experience in such matters. A glazier, perhaps, or a handyman familiar with the houses. Maintenance. The estate has several such individuals on staff. Then we must question each of them regarding their whereabouts on the night in question and their knowledge of glazing work. But even as Poirot spoke, his mind was working through another possibility. The sealed window had been an elaborate solution to a simple problem, introducing poison into a locked room. But elaborate solutions often suggested elaborate thinking. Someone with intelligence, with knowledge of both glazing and the house's architecture, with access to resources and time. That night, Poirot did something he rarely did. He attended the gathering at the White Hart's bar, where the local gentlemen congregated for their evening drinks. He sat quietly in the corner, nursing a tisane, and listened. "It's the manager, certainly," he heard one shopkeeper declare. "Thornton's the one who poisoned her. She'd discovered his theft, and he poisoned her to silence her." "But how?" another voice objected. "The room was locked from inside. Unless he somehow got into the house without anyone seeing, went up to her room, poisoned her drink, and left again. Seems impossible, don't it?" "Nothing's impossible for a desperate man," the first replied. But Poirot knew that, in fact, something very specific had been possible, and only a limited number of people possessed the knowledge and access to accomplish it. He finished his tisane and departed, his mind working through the elaborate puzzle with that characteristic precision that had earned him his reputation. On the morning of October 16th, 5 days after Miss Ashford's funeral, Eleanor Finch did not report for work at Marchmont Hall. When a servant was sent to inquire after her at her mother's cottage in the village, it was discovered that the young woman had consumed a considerable quantity of laudanum during the night. She was discovered by her mother in a state of semi-consciousness and was removed to the hospital in the nearby town of Ashford. The physician's initial assessment suggested accidental overdose. Eleanor apparently had suffered from insomnia since discovering her mistress's body and had been prescribed laudanum by the local doctor. An excess dose, whether deliberately administered or taken in error, had produced the present calamity. Yet Poirot, when informed of this development, did not accept the accident hypothesis. He proceeded immediately to Eleanor's cottage and examined her room with his characteristic thoroughness. "Tell me," he said to Eleanor's mother, a woman of perhaps 60 with an expression of profound distress, "did your daughter purchase the laudanum recently?" "Yes, just 3 days ago. Dr. Hastings prescribed it for her nerves. poor girl has been quite distraught since Miss Ashford's death. And the bottle? It was full when she received it? To the best of my knowledge, yes. Poirot examined the remains of the bottle, which had been left on Eleanor's bedside table. He noted the amount of liquid remaining, perhaps an eighth of the original quantity, and made certain calculations. The physician who attended her, did he express surprise at the quantity she had consumed? He said she must have drunk nearly the entire bottle. Yet, Poirot observed, if a normal dose is 2 drams, and the bottle contains perhaps 20 drams, then Miss Finch would have needed to consume 10 times the therapeutic dose. The human body generally prevents such an action. The taste becomes disagreeable, the stomach rebels. It is possible, but requires considerable determination or unconsciousness. He turned to examine Eleanor's room with greater attention. The window was unlatched. Upon the dressing table lay writing materials, and beside them a piece of paper containing a brief message. I cannot bear the weight of what I know. Forgive me, Poirot read this with considerable interest. When was this note discovered? I found it this morning next to the laudanum bottle, Eleanor's mother replied. And you did not think to preserve it or to report it to the police? I supposed it was Eleanor's intention. I was so distressed I scarcely knew what to do. Poirot took the note carefully, using his handkerchief. The handwriting was Eleanor's. He was sufficiently familiar with her script from examining Miss Ashford's household. But something about the composition troubled him. The message was too neat, too carefully formulated. It was the note one might write if one had carefully considered it, not the desperate scrawl of someone in genuine despair. He proceeded directly to the hospital and requested an interview with Eleanor. The young woman was conscious, though still drowsy, and her responses were somewhat halting. Yet her mind was sufficiently clear for Poirot's purposes. Miss Finch, he began gently, I am Hercule Poirot, and I am investigating certain matters related to your mistress's death. I wonder if you might assist me in clarifying certain details. Eleanor's eyes widened in panic. I've told the police everything I know. I am certain you have. Yet there may be details that seemed insignificant at the time, but which acquire new meaning in light of recent developments. Tell me, on the night Miss Ashford died, did anyone visit her room after she retired for the evening? No, I cannot be certain. I was in my own room preparing for bed. I heard nothing until the bell rang at 2 in the morning. And the dinner dress that Miss Ashford wore, she had worn it during the evening, had she not? Yet she wore it alone in her room. Why would this be? Eleanor hesitated, and in her hesitation, Poirot perceived the presence of knowledge she was reluctant to divulge. There was a visitor, Eleanor admitted at last. A gentleman visitor. Miss Ashford did not wish the household staff to know, so she received him in her room. I was to ensure that no one disturbed them. And this gentleman, who was he? I don't know his name. He arrived after dinner, entering through the side entrance. I'd been instructed to await him and conduct him to Miss Ashford's room directly. And how long did this visit continue? Perhaps an hour, maybe somewhat longer. He departed after 11 o'clock, and I saw him from the back corridor as he left the house. Did you observe his appearance? His approximate age? Any distinguishing characteristics? Eleanor's expression became distressed. I shouldn't speak of this. He asked me not to, and I promised Miss Ashford I would maintain discretion. But now she's dead, and I wondered whether I should have told someone. Tell me now, Poirot urged gently. It may be of considerable importance. He was a gentleman of perhaps 40, dark-haired with a severe appearance. He wore well-tailored clothing. I remember thinking he had an air of authority about him. Poirot's mind worked through the available candidates. Lord Marchmont was 70, not 40. Victor Ashford was 35, perhaps young enough. But Poirot doubted Eleanor would describe him as severe. Henry Ashford was 67. The solicitor Calloway was perhaps 50. And then there was William Thornton, the estate manager, a man Poirot had not yet interviewed at length, a man who would certainly have authority and likely had familiarity with the house's architecture. "Miss Finch," Poirot said carefully, "did you consume the laudanum of your own volition, or was it administered to you?" I took it myself, or at least I believe I did. My memory is confused. I remember the bottle being there, and then I remember waking in the hospital. And the note you left, did you write that? I don't recall writing it, but it is in my handwriting, is it not? Indeed, it appears to be. Yet someone placed that bottle on your bedside table, and someone, perhaps someone other than yourself, administered the laudanum. Eleanor's face went pale. "You mean I was poisoned? Intentionally?" "I mean that someone wished you to appear to have poisoned yourself. The distinction, while subtle, is of considerable significance." That afternoon, Poirot sat in his room at the White Hart and arranged the facts of the case before him with meticulous precision. He had procured a substantial stock of paper and had written out each element of evidence in his characteristic fashion. Names, dates, times, motives, opportunities. The picture that emerged was troubling in its implications. Miss Ashford had discovered fraud. Miss Ashford had been poisoned by someone with knowledge of glazing and access to her window from outside. Eleanor Finch, who had harboured the secret of Miss Ashford's mysterious visitor, had been partially poisoned, whether intentionally or as a warning, Poirot could not yet determine. The pattern suggested itself. Miss Ashford possessed knowledge that threatened someone's position or reputation, that someone had resolved to prevent the revelation of that knowledge by eliminating her, and then, discovering that Eleanor might furnish evidence regarding the mysterious visitor, had attempted to eliminate her as well. But who among his suspects possessed sufficient motive and opportunity to accomplish both crimes? He reviewed his interviews with deliberate care, noting inconsistencies and evasions. Victor Ashford had been vague regarding his whereabouts and had proven defensive when questioned about the mysterious V in Miss Ashford's journal. Yet Poirot saw no evidence that Victor possessed knowledge of glazing work. The man's hands were soft, his bearing that of someone accustomed to leisure rather than labour. Lord Marchmont had evinced genuine confidence regarding his own innocence, yet Poirot had observed in his manner a curious quality of calculation, as though the man was carefully considering how to present himself, and Lord Marchmont certainly possessed authority and resources. Henry Ashford had proven straightforward and direct, yet Poirot sensed that the elderly solicitor had not revealed everything he knew about his niece's discoveries. Regarding the estate fraud, Richard Calloway had been appropriately professional and circumspect, as one would expect of a man trained in legal discretion. And then there was William Thornton, whom Poirot had not interviewed at length. The estate manager was a man of perhaps 45, with competent bearing, and the manner of one accustomed to executing decisions made by others of higher social standing. But William Thornton was not at Marchmont. Inquiry had revealed that he had departed for London on urgent business the day after Miss Ashford's death, and had sent no word of his return. It was this fact that struck Poirot with particular force. A man implicated in the fraud that Miss Ashford had discovered had departed the village immediately after her death. The coincidence seemed altogether too convenient. Yet even this did not fully resolve the matter. The question of Eleanor's mysterious visitor remained. and the nature of the poisoning suggested planning, knowledge, and considerable nerve. That evening, Poirot received a telegram from London. He had requested that inquiries be made regarding William Thornton's activities and associates. The response was illuminating. William Thornton had checked into a hotel in Bloomsbury under an assumed name and had remained there for only 2 days before departing for France. More significantly, certain records had been examined regarding his family connections, and it was discovered that his younger sister was married to a chemist who worked in a laboratory that manufactured both pharmaceuticals and commercial poisons. The threads were beginning to connect themselves, yet Poirot remained unsatisfied. The picture possessed a certain elegance, yet it lacked the quality of inevitability that characterized the conclusions to which his logic had led in past investigations. It was Victor Ashford's evasiveness that preoccupied him. There had been something in the man's response when questioned about V that suggested more than mere embarrassment. There had been fear, genuine, palpable fear. Poirot made a decision. On the morning of October 23rd, he sent messages requesting that all the principal suspects meet him at Marchmont Hall at 3 o'clock that afternoon. He had something to reveal, he suggested, that would be of interest to all parties. The gathering assembled in Marchmont Hall's drawing room, a chamber of considerable size and some pretension, with a fireplace of carved marble and furniture that reflected the conservative tastes of late Victorian era. Present were Inspector Jameson, Victor Ashford, Lord Marchmont, Henry Ashford, Richard Calloway, and Mrs. Hartwell, whom Poirot had specifically requested. "I have called you here," Poirot began, "because I believe the time has come to address certain matters that have heretofore remained obscure. Miss Catherine Ashford was poisoned not by chance, not by accident, but by design. The question of who administered the poison, however, is more complex than circumstances might suggest." He paused and observed the reactions of his audience. Victor Ashford was pale, his hands trembling slightly. Lord Marchmont appeared unmoved, his expression one of polite interest. Henry Ashford watched Poirot with considerable attention. Calloway maintained his professional distance. "The poisoning," Poirot continued, "was accomplished by introducing strychnine into water that Miss Ashford consumed. This water was placed upon her bedside table, and she drank from it during the early hours of October 11th. The remarkable feature of this crime is not the method, but the access. Miss Ashford had locked her door and her windows, yet the poisoner was able to introduce the poison into her room nonetheless. The window," Inspector Jameson said. "You discovered evidence regarding the window?" "Precisely, Inspector. The window had been unsealed from the exterior, the glass removed, replaced, and resealed. A procedure requiring considerable skill and knowledge. A procedure that would have been performed by someone intimately familiar with the house, its maintenance, and its vulnerabilities." He turned directly to Mrs. Hartwell. "You will perhaps recognize the description of this work." Mrs. Hartwell's expression did not change, but Poirot observed the sudden tension in her shoulders. "I do not," she said carefully. "Then permit me to remind you. 4 years ago, when young Mr. Victor took residence in this house, certain repairs were required to his room, repairs that involved the replacement of window panes and recaulking of frames. This work was performed by a tradesman whom you hired. That tradesman was a man named John Hartwell, your grandson, I believe." A silence fell upon the room. Mrs. Hartwell's face had become very still. "John has been deceased for 3 years," she said quietly. "Yes. And grievously did you mourn his loss. Yet your grief became entangled with something else, did it not? Resentment. Resentment that Miss Ashford, who had refused to provide John with employment despite your repeated requests, had rejected your grandson without acknowledging the genuine skills he had acquired as a glazier and tradesman. "That is purely speculation," Mrs. Hartwell said, but her voice trembled slightly. "Consider it if you will. Miss Ashford was a woman of principle, and indeed of some coldness in her personal relations. John Hartwell sought employment, was refused, and subsequently took his own life. A tragedy that you ascribed, at least in part, to Miss Ashford's rejection of your grandson." "This is outrageous," Victor Ashford interjected. "You are suggesting that Mrs. Hartwell murdered Catherine? Preposterous! The woman is harmless." "Harmless, yes," Poirot acknowledged, "and yet capable of a singular act of passion and revenge. But I do not suggest that Mrs. Hartwell herself administered the poison. I suggest, rather, that she supplied the knowledge by which the poison could be administered. She knew the house. She knew that a window could be unsealed, and she provided this information to someone who possessed both the motive and the opportunity to utilize it." He turned to face the room directly. "That someone is William Thornton, the estate manager who has since fled to France. Mr. Thornton was implicated in the fraud that Miss Ashford had discovered, yet his motivation for murder was not mere self-preservation. Mr. Thornton and Mrs. Hartwell's grandson, John, were associates and friends. John's death affected Mr. Thornton considerably, and when Miss Ashford's inquiries into the estate accounts threatened Mr. Thornton's position, he saw in her death both a solution to his own difficulties and an act of retribution on behalf of the friend who had preceded her into eternity." "But Eleanor Finch," Calloway objected. "Why would Thornton attempt to poison her?" "Because Eleanor harboured knowledge of the mysterious visitor who had met with Miss Ashford on the evening of her death. That visitor was neither Lord Marchmont nor any of the other gentlemen you might have suspected. It was a solicitor from London, retained by Miss Ashford to prepare legal documents regarding the fraud she had uncovered. Eleanor could identify this visitor and could testify that Miss Ashford had been meeting with parties outside the household regarding the matter of the estate accounts. This testimony might have encouraged more thorough investigation into the matter, and might have directed suspicion toward Thornton and his associate." He paused and observed his audience. As for the specific method by which the poisoning was accomplished, it was accomplished thus. Mrs. Hartwell, who regularly occupied the drawing room adjoining Miss Ashford's bedroom, was instructed to ensure that the poisoned water would be placed upon Miss Ashford's bedside table during the afternoon of October 10th. At approximately midnight, Mr. Thornton, using knowledge of the glazing techniques that John Hartwell had described to him, unsealed Miss Ashford's window from the exterior. He removed the glass and ensured that the poisoned water remained undisturbed upon the table. He then replaced the glass and resealed the window. The entire operation required perhaps 20 minutes. Miss Ashford, returning to her room after her secret visitor had departed, noticed nothing unusual about the water. She consumed it at approximately 2 in the morning and died within an hour. Victor Ashford stood abruptly. "This is madness. Mrs. Hartwell would never—" "Mrs. Hartwell," Poirot said calmly, "acted from human motivation, which is rarely entirely sane. Yet she acted, and she will answer for her actions. As for Mr. Thornton, I have confidence that the French authorities will ultimately apprehend him and return him to face justice." He gestured to Inspector Jameson. "I suggest, Inspector, that you place Mrs. Hartwell in custody, pending further investigation. The evidence I have assembled should be sufficient to justify such action." The interrogation of Mrs. Hartwell took place the following morning at the local constabulary office. Inspector Jameson conducted the formal questioning. while Poirot observed from an adjacent chamber, studying the woman's expressions and responses through a connecting window. Initially, Mrs. Hartwell maintained her composure and denied any involvement in Miss Ashford's death. Yet, as Jameson gradually revealed the evidence, the inquiry regarding John Hartwell's employment, the conversations between John and William Thornton, the traces of Mrs. Hartwell's communication with Thornton in the months preceding the murder, her resistance began to crumble. "He was a good boy," she said eventually, her voice devoid of its former controlled steadiness. "A brilliant boy, really. So clever with his hands, so eager to learn. When he sought employment from Miss Ashford, I was confident she would see his merit. I was quite certain. When she refused to even meet him, when she refused with such evident disdain, I could not forgive her for that." "Yet you did not strike Miss Ashford yourself," Jameson noted carefully. "You did not administer the poison. No, I am not a murderer. When Mr. Thornton approached me, when he suggested that Miss Ashford had discovered certain accounting irregularities and was preparing to bring legal action that would result in charges against him, I understood that he saw an opportunity to resolve the matter by ensuring her silence. I told him how the windows might be unsealed. I provided him with information regarding her habits and routines. But I could not have done the thing itself." "Yet you are complicit in her death," Jameson said. "You provided assistance with the knowledge that it would result in her murder." Yes, I suppose that is true." In the following days, additional evidence emerged through the efforts of the French authorities and Scotland Yard. William Thornton was located attempting to board a ship to South America. Documents in his possession revealed extensive correspondence with Mrs. Hartwell, including detailed discussions of the poisoning method and the unsealing of the window. Toxicological analysis of Eleanor Finch's remaining laudanum confirmed that an excessive quantity of strychnine had been dissolved in it, a sufficient dose to ensure her death had she consumed the entire bottle. Most significantly, chemical analysis revealed that the strychnine used in both the poisoning of Miss Ashford and the attempted poisoning of Eleanor Finch had originated from the laboratory in which Thornton's sister's husband was employed. The evidence was overwhelming, yet one mystery remained partially obscure until Richard Calloway provided clarification. The mysterious visitor to Miss Ashford's room on the evening of October 10th had indeed been a London solicitor, engaged by Miss Ashford to prepare legal documentation regarding the fraud. But Calloway revealed an additional detail that Poirot had not previously ascertained. Miss Ashford had been prepared to prosecute Lord Marchmont himself, should the investigation warrant it, Calloway explained. She had discovered that his signature appeared on certain documents authorizing fraudulent expenditures. Whether this was done with his knowledge, or whether his signature was forged, we could not determine. But Miss Ashford was determined that the truth would emerge. This revelation cast new light upon Lord Marchmont's composure and confidence. Either he had indeed engaged in fraud with full knowledge, and was content to rely upon his social position to protect him from prosecution, or he had been the victim of a forgery perpetrated by Thornton. The evidence ultimately leaned toward the latter interpretation. Thornton's skill with documentation had evidently extended to his ability to reproduce Lord Marchmont's signature. On a grey afternoon, some 6 weeks after Miss Ashford's death, Poirot gathered all interested parties at Marchmont Hall for a final exposition. Inspector Jameson was present, along with Lord Marchmont, Henry Ashford, Victor Ashford, Richard Calloway, and Eleanor Finch, who had recovered from her ordeal and had been released from the hospital 3 weeks prior. Poirot stood before the assembled company. his hands clasped before him, his celebrated moustache positioned at its characteristically acute angle. "The case of Miss Catherine Ashford's murder," he began, "presents itself as extraordinarily complex, yet, in its essentials, exhibits the clarity that always characterizes the working of criminal logic. A crime committed by two individuals, yet motivated by multiple factors: revenge, self-preservation, twisted loyalty to the memory of the dead. Let us examine the facts as they have been established. Miss Ashford discovered accounting irregularities in the estate records. These irregularities had been perpetrated by William Thornton, the estate manager, who had diverted substantial sums to his own use. The discovery of this fraud threatened not merely Thornton's employment, but his liberty, as the amounts involved were sufficient to warrant criminal prosecution. Simultaneously, Miss Ashford was dealing with Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, in a manner that reflected her rigid principles. When Mrs. Hartwell's grandson John sought employment, Miss Ashford refused to grant it, not from malice, but from a conviction that the young man was unsuitable for the position. Subsequently, John Hartwell took his own life, and Mrs. Hartwell ascribed his death, at least in part, to Miss Ashford's rejection of his application. Now, it was when these two currents of grievance converged that the murder became possible. Thornton, desperate to prevent exposure of his fraud, approached Mrs. Hartwell with a proposal: assist him in murdering Miss Ashford, and he would ensure that her death appeared to be caused by circumstances that would reflect favourably upon the household staff. Mrs. Hartwell, consumed by resentment toward Miss Ashford and made vulnerable by grief for her grandson, consented to this proposition. The method employed was singularly ingenious. A locked room presented no difficulty to Thornton, who had acquired knowledge of the house's vulnerabilities through his association with John Hartwell, who had worked as a glazier. Thornton utilized this knowledge to unseal Miss Ashford's window from the exterior, thereby introducing the poisoned water into her room while she slept. Yet even the most carefully conceived crimes contain within them the seeds of their own exposure. Thornton recognized that Eleanor Finch constituted a danger to him, as she possessed knowledge of Miss Ashford's secret meeting with the London solicitor. He therefore attempted to eliminate her as well, employing the crude method of poison disguised as an accidental laudanum overdose. The failure of this second attempt to commit murder for Eleanor's system rejected the excessive poison, ultimately preserved evidence that convicted Thornton and implicated Mrs. Hartwell in his scheme. Thus does justice, in its slow but inevitable fashion, eventually assert itself. Miss Ashford, despite her limitations of human warmth, deserves vindication, and those who contributed to her death must answer for their actions before the law. Poirot paused and observed the reactions of his audience. Lord Marchmont appeared relieved, presumably because evidence of his own complicity in fraud had been substantially diminished by Thornton's flight. Victor Ashford seemed to be processing the conclusion that his anxiety regarding the mysterious visitor, about which he had made certain inquiries, had been entirely unfounded. Henry Ashford nodded slowly, as though acknowledging the logic of Poirot's exposition. Eleanor Finch wept quietly, her tears reflecting both the resolution of the mystery and her sorrow for the woman she had served and, ultimately, for the housekeeper she had come to pity. "I have a question, Monsieur Poirot," Henry Ashford said at length. "You demonstrated considerable knowledge regarding the method of the poisoning and the identities of those responsible. Yet some of this knowledge could not possibly have been apparent without information that came to light subsequent to Miss Ashford's death. How did you acquire this knowledge so rapidly?" Poirot permitted himself a slight smile. "An observation, Mr. Ashford, the humble observation of what lay before one, combined with the elimination of the impossible, leaving only the truth, however improbable. When I examined Miss Ashford's window and discovered evidence of recent caulking work, I inquired regarding the history of such work at the house. When I learned that John Hartwell, the housekeeper's grandson, had been employed as a glazier, and when I subsequently discovered that he had known William Thornton, the pattern began to resolve itself. From there it was merely a matter of confirming my suspicions through logical deduction and careful interrogation. He turned to address Inspector Jameson directly. "Inspector, the authorities in France have apprehended Mr. Thornton." "Indeed, Monsieur Poirot. He is now in custody and will face extradition proceedings." "Excellent. And Mrs. Hartwell? She remains in custody pending trial?" "She does. Her attorney suggests she will likely plead guilty and offer a confession in exchange for leniency." A wise course. The courts may yet show mercy to a woman driven to complicity in murder by grief and resentment, though the law, of course, must take its course. The trials of William Thornton and Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell occupied the attention of the local legal community for much of the following spring. Thornton was convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to death by hanging. Mrs. Hartwell, having pleaded guilty and provided testimony that confirmed the essential facts of Poirot's deduction, received a sentence of 20 years' imprisonment, a sentence that reflected the court's acknowledgement of her complicity while recognizing the human weakness and grief that had driven her. Actions Aunt Eleanor Finch recovered fully from her poisoning, and subsequently obtained a position as a lady's maid to a respectable family in Sussex. Away from Marchmont and its associations with tragedy, she maintained a correspondence with Poirot, expressing gratitude for his investigation and his role in uncovering the truth regarding Miss Ashford's death. Victor Ashford remained at Marchmont Hall, and in the absence of Miss Ashford's authority, the household fell into a more relaxed and comfortable state. He eventually took a position with a London publishing firm, pursuing a career of modest success. He married a woman of respectable family, and by all accounts, conducted himself with considerable propriety. Lord Marchmont, while entirely exonerated of criminal wrongdoing, found his reputation somewhat diminished by the revelation of fraud perpetrated in his name. He subsequently dismissed his remaining staff members implicated in the matter and engaged a new manager of considerably more scrupulous character. The matter of the fraudulent estate accounts was eventually resolved, with the majority of the diverted funds recovered through legal proceedings against Thornton's personal assets and his family connections. Formal apologies were issued, and the estate resumed its normal operations. Poirot departed Marchmont on a morning in early April, as the English spring asserted itself with tentative greenery, and the tentative warmth of a season emerging from winter. Inspector Jameson accompanied him to the station, and as the train prepared to depart, Jameson extended his hand in gratitude. "You have resolved this matter with admirable precision, Monsieur Poirot. I confess that had I pursued the investigation alone, I would likely have concluded that the sealed window represented an insurmountable obstacle, and I might have focused my attention upon individuals without the knowledge or capability to unseal it." "The sealed window," Poirot replied, "presented to the investigator a choice. One might conclude, as many would, that the absence of apparent entry constituted proof of impossibility. Yet I have learned, Inspector, that impossibility is often merely the absence of imagination. When one recognizes that a particular task requires specific knowledge and skill, one then inquires, who among the available suspects possesses such knowledge? And when one discovers an individual who does, and whose motivations align with opportunity. The pattern becomes clear. The train began to move, and Poirot settled into his first-class compartment with a copy of the Times and a small thermos of hot chocolate. As the countryside of Kent passed beyond the window, he reflected upon the curious case that had occupied his time. The mystery of Miss Catherine Ashford's death had been, in its essentials, a matter of human failing and emotional fragility. A woman's rigidity of principle had alienated those around her. A man's weakness in the face of financial difficulty had driven him to fraud. An elderly woman's grief had rendered her vulnerable to complicity and murder. These were not the grand motivations of literature or theatre, but rather the small, human failings that characterized most criminal enterprise. Yet there was, Poirot reflected, a certain tragic symmetry to the matter. Miss Ashford had died as a consequence of her commitment to principle. Her investigation into fraud had made her dangerous to those who benefited from dishonesty. Mrs. Hartwell had lost her grandson to what she perceived as Mrs. Ashford's cold indifference, and in her desire for vengeance she had surrendered her own liberty. And William Thornton, driven to desperation by the threat of exposure, had sacrificed his own future in an attempt to preserve his present circumstances. All of them, in their various ways, had been destroyed by forces that operated according to the logic of human nature and human weakness. The train rolled on toward London, and Poirot closed his eyes, contemplating the curious mathematics by which crime and retribution balanced themselves in the scales of justice. When he opened his eyes again, he observed a particular quality of light filtering through the window. The light of early spring, of renewal, of the promise of fresh beginnings. Behind him, in the small village of Marchmont, the great houses would continue their ordered existence. The servants would go about their duties. The local society would conduct itself according to rigid social conventions, and the parish church would continue its eternal function as repository of human hopes and sorrows. Yet something in Marchmont had been altered forever. The innocent had been murdered. The guilty had been apprehended, and justice, in its slow but inevitable fashion, had made its presence felt. Poirot opened his newspaper and read, with his customary care and precision, the accounts of the world proceeding about him. A world that contained infinite complexity, infinite variation on the themes of human strength and human weakness. And in his compartment aboard the train, secure in the knowledge of a mystery resolved and justice served, Hercule Poirot permitted himself a small, satisfied smile.